Hello, and welcome to the League of Women Voters Forum for candidates for Pennsylvania's 23rd Legislative District, consisting of areas within the city of Pittsburgh, including Greenfield, Oakland, Point Breeze, Shadyside, and Squirrel Hill. My name is Jessica Lynch, and I'm a member of the League of Women Voters of Greater Pittsburgh Voter Services Committee, and I'll be your moderator for today's forum. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization. We neither support nor oppose any candidate or political party. I cannot overemphasize that point. Our goal is to provide information to citizens so that they can actively participate in their government. This online forum is one way of doing that. It is being conducted and recorded via video conference. The forum is available for viewing on demand in its entirety on the League's Facebook page after the event has concluded. The general election for this legislative position will be held on Tuesday, November 3rd. Voters have the option of voting in person, by mail-in, or absentee ballot. Specific information, as well as the deadlines for any applications and ballot returns, can be found on the Pennsylvania State website, votespa.com. Now we turn to today's forum. We have set aside 60 minutes to ask questions of the candidates. Behind the scenes, we drew straws to determine the order in which the candidates will be questioned and speak. Each candidate will have a chance to answer each question and will have 1 minute, 30 seconds, 90 seconds for each response. There will be no time given for rebuttals. However, if a candidate wishes to respond to another candidate's statements, he will need to use his time from the answer to the next question. I will be asking the questions in a rotating manner so that each candidate will have the chance to be the first to answer a question. We will conclude with each candidate having 1 minute and 30 seconds for a closing statement. Questions have been gathered from a variety of sources, including community input, the League's Facebook page, and vote411.org, which is the League's online voters guide. Questions have been reviewed for relevance to the position being sought, and also for duplication, clarity, and civility. Candidate answers will be timed, and the candidates will note when their time is expired. The candidates will be allowed to finish their current sentence at that time, but not to add additional sentences after it. Please remember that these candidates are your friends and neighbors who have stepped forward seeking to serve their community. And now I'd like to introduce each of the candidates. The candidates for the 23rd Pennsylvania Legislative District are Representative Dan Frankel, the Democratic candidate, and Mr. J. Ting Walker, the Green Party candidate. I welcome you both to this forum and thank you very much for your participation. Let's begin. The first question will be posed to Mr. Frankel, who won the coin toss. Mr. Frankel, what experience do you have that qualifies you and prepares you for this position?
Thank you very much, and thank you for hosting today's forum. I wish we had more of these across the state this year, but suffice it to be that we're doing this one, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. I've spent the last 22 years in the legislature, but my background before that was as a small business person, an insurance agent, and subsequently during that period of time, as a private citizen, I was engaged in doing a lot of community work. I was the president of the board of the Jewish Family Services, a social service agency that provides all kinds of services in our community and the greater community, including being the most significant and largest provider of services to immigrants in our community and refugees that need to be resettled. I've also chaired advocacy groups. I was the president of the Pennsylvania Jewish Coalition, and we did advocacy at the state level to enhance human services that are provided by faith-based organizations. We did advocacy for social justice issues and tried to build community among different types of communities across the state. So I think I bring a great deal of experience. I've served in leadership positions within my caucus, Allegheny County Delegation Chair, Democratic Caucus Chair, and currently the Democratic Chair of the Health Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Frankel. Mr. Walker, same question. What experience do you have that qualifies you and prepares you for this position?
I want to thank you all for having me today. My experience includes a variety of experiences, both in my professional life, in my personal life, and also in my history of activism, not only in Pittsburgh, but elsewhere as well. So in my professional life, I'm a community organizer for an environmental nonprofit, Clean Air Council, where I work on both petrochemical expansions, fracking, pipelines, as well as air quality issues, including our major source emitters, the Clairton Coke Works, other US Steel facilities. So through that work, I've been able to read legislation, study legislation, and even write some legislation that we've been developing. I've also been a longtime activist here in Pittsburgh with multiple organizations, as well as in my college life at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, where I studied biology and economics, but was very active with the environmental movement there. And lastly, I have a lot of personal experience that's rather unique. I'm mixed race background. I'm half Black and half Chinese, yet most people interpret me as a white person. I grew up in an extremely diverse school and neighborhood in New York City, and I also grew up poor, and I continue to be, not very wealthy. So I think that's a unique experience for the legislature that needs to be reflected in our representation.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. And so now the next question, Mr. Walker, goes to you first. What issues do you see as the highest priority, and what will you do to address these issues?
So my number one priority, and the reason I'm running for this office, is to tackle climate change. The number one way I see to do that is to ban fracking in Pennsylvania. Our energy use provides for about a third of our greenhouse gas emissions. And although we've done better transitioning from coal to fracking, we've already achieved most of those reductions that would be possible. And the next step would be to end the practice of fracking. So I would start with a moratorium in new wells, new drilling, and a rapid phase out of existing wells. This issue is definitely my top issue, but that's just part of the battle, is reducing our emissions. We also have to rapidly transition to 100% renewable energy by 2030. We're going to have to do that through a combination of different methods. We have to we need to further incentivize renewable energy. We also need to invest more aggressively in weatherization programs and energy efficiency. We also have to prepare for climate change mitigation, mitigating the impacts of climate change. That looks like flooding, increased rainfall, things like that. And lastly, we also have to aggressively close abandoned wells. There's fracking wells that exist all across the state, and the fund that we have to close those wells is not enough to properly pay for those, and we're going to be left holding the bag.
Thank you. Frankel, same question. What issues do you see as the highest priority, and what will you do to address these issues?
Well, there are a slew of issues that I've been engaged in over the years that have been major priorities for me, from social issues, abortion rights, civil rights for the LGBTQ community, environmental justice. But the thing that is totally consuming us today, that really has taken over the agenda and bleeds over a number of different issues, is the pandemic that we're experiencing right now and how we're going to deal with it. We're facing some existential threats, with respect to what may happen after this election. We have Affordable Care Act, which gives access to health care to hundreds of thousands of Pennsylvanians that didn't have it before, preserves coverage for pre-existing conditions that could be invalidated by a Supreme Court decision that is sitting there right now. We have to be prepared at the state level to walk into that breach, to make sure that people aren't left without access to this coverage. They're going to have to pay for vaccines. We have to deal with the economic damage that's done to working families, the poor, to small businesses, and we make sure that everybody has health care. We need to make sure that, from a standpoint, we extend the moratorium on evictions. I mean, people now are staring in the face of being evicted from their homes. We need to make sure that we extend that moratorium immediately. So these things are right in front of us right now. We've got to deal with it.
Thank you very much. And thank you, gentlemen, for those introductory statements. And you'll find a lot of the things that you've brought up will now go to a series of detailed questions that will cover and dive into those very points. Thank you. The next several questions do in fact deal with the challenges facing our country and the Pittsburgh area caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. The first question deals specifically with the public health aspects. What have you learned from the pandemic and its effects? And how should we address this current challenge in our public health system in our communities? Mr. Frankel, the question to you first, please.
Well, we've totally disinvested from our public health system. I mean, today we're spending less than half of what we spent on public health that we did 20 years ago. And we found ourselves, not just as a state, but as a country, completely flat-footed in trying to address that, on top of the fact that the administration in Washington has totally bungled this. But we have got to be able to make significant investments to be prepared here, because this pandemic, God willing, is going to come to an end, and we're going to have a vaccine and therapies to treat it. But we're going to have other pandemics that come down the road, and we need to be prepared. So, for instance, one of the things I was engaged in was a proposal to make sure that we had the case investigators and the contact tracers that we need in order to mitigate and control the pandemic while we await the therapies and the vaccine. We didn't have it. This Department of Health, Secretary Levine and the governor have now focused on this. We're working with other nonprofit organizations in the Department of Health of the state. And we're lucky here in Allegheny County to have a robust Department of Health at the county level that is working very hard and doing great things and innovative things that we're using in other parts of the state in terms of being able to quarantine people in facilities that they now control. But we've got to be able to make these investments back because we don't need it just for this pandemic, but we're going to need it for the public health issues that we face down the road.
Thank you. Mr. Walker, do you need me to repeat the question?
Yes, could you repeat the question?
Sure. As you know, we're dealing with the challenges facing our country and the Pittsburgh area caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. The first question deals specifically with the public health aspects. What have you learned from this pandemic and its effects, and how should we address this current challenge to our public health system in our communities?
So I think this pandemic has really exposed the flaws in our current system. The biggest flaw that I see is the lack of a universal healthcare system. Having people who have healthcare tied to their employer in a situation where people are losing their job and losing their work with the economy slowing down, that's clearly a massive mistake. And you know, the healthcare system that we currently has already kind of unfairly ties workers to employers and prevents them from being able to pursue other jobs sometimes. Another thing that's made clear is that our social safety net is seriously lacking. There are plenty of holes in our systems, and the systems that we do have in place, we're unable to handle the massive surge in usage. So our economy is, we just realized that so many people in our economy are doing gig work or working at restaurants, working in precarious jobs. And that leaves me really concerned. It's not a very secure economy, and our economy is moving more and more towards those sorts of jobs. So we needed to have a massive test, isolate, and trace system to kind of handle the pandemic. And I think another lesson is that it applies to climate change too. We need to tackle these major global issues sooner rather than later. We can't wait for them to become a massive issue before we really do something about them. And another thing is we need to listen to the scientists. And the scientists right now are saying that we need to cut our emissions drastically by 2030.
Thank you. Thank you. Still regarding the pandemic, the financial suffering has exposed issues within our social and economic systems, as I think you've both just pointed out. What do you think are the gaps, and what would your proposals be to address them as we seek to recover from the global pandemic? Mr. Walker, to you first.
So I think the clear gaps were, one, people lost their incomes and they were not able to survive. They were struggling to feed themselves. They were struggling to pay their rent. Luckily, we had an evictions freeze that ended. But until then, it was looking very scary for people. So we need to make sure that the basic elements of human life are guaranteed in our society. our society is massively wealthy. There's no reason why we can't make sure that people are housed, that people are able to feed themselves, whether or not they lost their job. So one of the ways we would do this is with the universal basic income program. That's sort of like just it's the most basic of safety nets. If you need the safety net, it's there, and it's there for everybody. And the fact that it's universal makes it easier to administer. We've also seen that our unemployment compensation system was very difficult for people to apply for benefits that were much needed, and people were waiting a long time for their checks to come in. So we need to massively streamline that. And that's something that I dealt with when I worked at an employment law firm, and we helped many people apply for unemployment compensation. They were left waiting for a long time to get the benefits that they needed, and they needed to jump through jump through hoops to be able to prove that they did in fact earn these benefits that they chipped in for. So overall, we need more universal programs that make sure that basic human rights are ensured in our society.
Thank you. Mr. Frankel?
Sure. Well, it's clear. It's become, this pandemic has really exposed in a glaring way something that many of us already knew existed, and that were the extraordinary disparities that exist both economically with respect to healthcare in disadvantaged communities and communities of color. I held a hearing about 2 months ago as the chair of the Health Committee, along with my colleague Steve Kinsey, who is the Pennsylvania Legislative Black Caucus chair, to talk about this, because what we know in the most basic area is that the results in terms of infection rates and mortality rates in disadvantaged communities and communities of color are foul outstrip their proportion of representation within our community. So they're being affected disproportionately in extraordinary ways. And it goes back to access to healthcare, access to fresh food, access to safe and affordable housing, and being able to make a livable wage for your family, including increasing the minimum wage, which is one of the ways we need to address this, including for tipped workers that work in the restaurants that Jay talked about. We have a lot of work to do in order to address these disparities. And while it's shocking what we found out here, it certainly wasn't unexpected. We should take this opportunity now that's become clear to address those issues.
Thank you. Still regarding the COVID-19 pandemic, would you support or oppose legislation to enact a rental relief program during the pandemic and recovery period? Why or why not? Mr. Frankel, the question to you first, please.
Oh, absolutely. We need to be able to both support people who are, need to have a place to live, and we have to deal with landlords, many of which are, having small, they're not big developers. They are people who may own a couple of units. Sorry, somebody's cutting my grass unexpectedly. We need to make sure that we have a stock of affordable housing. We need to make it available. We need to make sure that people can afford to stay in their rental units, and we need to make sure that landlords can stay in business and maintain and keep upkeep within their properties as well.
Thank you. Mr. Walker.
Yeah, absolutely. Housing is a human right. The activist groups that I follow, I spend time with, they make that very clear. People should be able to live in homes regardless of not whether they lose their jobs. I definitely support a rent relief and also mortgage relief, as Representative Frankel mentioned. And another thing that concerns me is that for a while, Governor Wolf was renewing a rent freeze, an evictions moratorium. And for some reason, he decided he needed to stop doing that and push it to the legislature, which did not move this. So that led to our state's eviction moratorium ending. Luckily, something from the CDC made it so that it's harder to evict people, but it's still not the same as if Governor Wolf just gave an executive order extending the eviction moratorium. I'm really disappointed that he hasn't done that. But in addition, we have a housing issue that extends long beyond the pandemic. So one of the things that I support aggressively is publicly funded housing. social housing as they do in Europe. People should be able to live in housing that is provided by the government, that they chip into with taxes, and we have funding mechanisms to do that sort of thing through the Department of Community Economic Development and also through CDBG funds from the federal government. And that's our state should be providing these basic human rights to all of our citizens, regardless of their income.
Thank you. One of the polarizing issues in Pennsylvania and across the nation has been the push to reopen schools and businesses versus the need to curb the spread of the virus and assure public health. What do you think the proper balance is, and what would you do to safely reopen our economy and social norms while mitigating the risks to the general public and especially those most vulnerable? Mr. Walker, the question to you first.
So I believe that we need to err on the side of caution. I understand that there's a lot of burdens that exist when businesses aren't open and schools aren't open, including childcare burdens, which again is another flaw in our social safety net, is lack of childcare for people who are working or who are trying to work from home. Yeah, we need to, I think, to move towards reopening schools and businesses. Again, like I said before, we need to test, isolate, and trace. And right now we're lacking the tests that we need to really be able to make sure we know where coronavirus outbreaks are in existence. So definitely we need to err on the side of caution. And I think it's become very polarized, like so much in our society. It's become a red versus blue, Republicans versus Democrats. But I'm not a Republican or a Democrat, and I think we can have this conversation in a way where it's not like everything that they say is wrong. Like, we need to be listening to people's real needs. I think the push to reopen is partially being fueled by right-wing narratives, Fox News, President Trump. But I also think there's a real pain that people are expressing. People are struggling to be able to take care of their children when they can't send them to school. So we need to be able to ramp up our COVID response so that we can properly manage this disease. Because I know the health department is doing a pretty good job, but we need to manage it at a better, a bigger scale.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Frankel?
Well, it's been a mirror image in Harrisburg of what's been happening in Washington, trying to undermine our governor here literally weekly. We were brought into session by my Republican colleagues. We've been in session more than any other legislature in the country, and all to basically chip away at the executive's authority to handle this pandemic. And it's hard to argue with the results that have taken place here, because Pennsylvania's infection rates, our mortality rates, the fact that none of our healthcare facilities became overwhelmed is a tribute to, I think, the mitigation efforts that were undertaken here. And unfortunately, it is partisan. I mean, it's partisan when I go to the House floor. Democrats are wearing masks, my Republican colleagues, not so much. And the whole issue of trying to give the legislature the authority to handle when to open, when to close, and to deal with surges as they come up, whether they're regionally or statewide, is absurd. To think that the legislature is nimble enough to be able to address these surges when they take place as we come into the fall and winter season where we expect them. We need the executive who's made mistakes, clearly, but we've all learned a lot more since this pandemic started. But the executive needs to be in a position to basically make the adjustments necessary when needed.
Thank you. Also, COVID-19 has laid bare major existing racial disparities in everything from housing to employment to healthcare to education, especially for Black and Brown Americans. What specific policies would you support to address these disparities and ensure that all Americans have equitable opportunities? Mr. Frankel, the question to you first, please.
Well, clearly, I talked about this in my earlier remarks to a great extent. So, independent of the COVID issue, this is a problem that has been in front of us forever, and it deals with trying to make sure that you have universal access to public education, including pre-K, universal access to higher education, so people can better themselves. And we need to finally address, we have the lowest minimum wage in the entire country. $7.25 an hour, the lowest. And we need to increase it to $15 an hour, include our tipped workers in that proposal. And we need to make sure that people have the access to the affordable housing. We need to make sure they have access to healthcare, which is obviously, as I said before, something that is hanging in the balance as we face this next Supreme Court session and decision that is forthcoming after the election. So it's glaring. This pandemic, as I said, it's laid it bare in a glaring way, and I hope it creates the momentum that we need in order to address it. We need to find the resources, and I think there are a number of different ways to do that. But we're also going to need help from the federal government dealing with a $5.5 billion state deficit that is going to be very difficult to address just internally without federal help. And the fact that we can't get a decision on the next relief package out of Washington is extraordinarily frustrating.
Thank you, Mr. Frankel. Mr. Walker?
Well, first of all, we need to stop relying on market mechanisms to address racial disparities. What we've seen over the past decades, not only in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, across the country from the federal government, is that reliance on market mechanisms to address racial disparities just leads to a few making large profits off of the back of Black and Brown communities. So you talked about employment, healthcare, education. We need to desegregate our schools and our neighborhoods. The amount of segregation that we have, especially in Pittsburgh, including in District 23, is out of control. If you see the redlining maps of Pittsburgh from decades ago, they look exactly like the racial breakdown maps of our communities today. So we need to aggressively desegregate. And there's been a little bit of that with some of the Pittsburgh public schools busing patterns. But I've heard from students and parents that there's still segregation happening right here in our school district. So we need to kind of nip that in the bud. We also need to provide better affordable housing. And like I said before, we need to do this through social housing that's publicly funded. We have many funding programs that right now they go to developers, private developers, and we need to just invest that into our communities so that we make sure that no one is trying to make a profit by cutting corners. Lastly, we need to prioritize our COVID response in our Black communities that are suffering the worst impacts of the COVID pandemic, the worst health impacts. Thank you.
Thank you. We're now going to move on to a new topic of the environment. The American Lung Association states that the tri-state metro region is the 8th most polluted in the nation for airborne particles. What solutions and policies would you propose to address this problem? Mr. Walker?
First of all, we need to resist the attempt right now in the legislature to prevent the Title V pollution permit fees from increasing. That's one. Those fees need to increase so that we can properly fund our air and enforcement programs. So that's something we need to do right now in the short term. In the longer term, so our previous health director, Dr. Hacker at the Allegheny County Health Department, she created a list. Basically, she said we needed the state legislature to empower the Allegheny County Health Department in the county to further crack down on our major source polluters. So right now, this is also a political question because U.S. Steel is such a strong political player in our region. It can be hard to crack down on those major source facilities. So we need to pass legislation, kind of get around that political power that they wield so that we can empower our health department to crack down on them instead of blaming individuals like they had been doing before. It's just a few polluters in our region that are causing the vast majority of our health impacts. And all we need to do is hold them accountable. The law's already in place at the federal level, the Clean Air Law. All we need to do is kind of strengthen the tools that the health department has as it's ready through legislation.
Thank you. Mr. Frankel?
I would agree with that. That the health department does need to be empowered, and we should be doing that. But in addition to that, what we've seen over the last 20 years, particularly under Governor Corbett's 4-year tenure here, was a complete dismantling of the Department of Environmental Protection and the resources that we need in order to basically police the polluters. whether it's U.S. Steel Clayton Works, whether it's frackers. We can't manage this without the tools that we need. We can have all the laws on the books, but if you don't have resources that are dedicated to the enforcement, and you don't have enforcement penalties that are meaningful, we're gonna fall behind here. So we have to make those reinvestments again in the Department of Environmental Protection, in our departments of health. Unfortunately, around the state, we're lucky here in Allegheny County to have a health department, but only 5 counties in the entire state have their own health departments. And so the rest of the state basically depends on the State Department of Health as well. So we just have disinvested, and we need to provide the tools to basically regulate and enforce environmental standards that are necessary to have a quality of life in our community that we expect, and to have the health outcomes that we want for every community. And clearly, one of the things that my colleague Summer Lee has identified is that, you know, one of the issues is an environmental justice issue, because the communities, disadvantaged communities, communities of color, are more exposed than many of our other communities, including the 23rd district to a certain extent. Thanks.
Thank you. Recent events have exposed the inequities in broadband access and the availability of computers for school-age children, which greatly impacts their ability to learn remotely. What specific solutions would you propose to ensure that all students have internet and computer access, including those in rural areas and underserved communities? Mr. Frankel?
Well, we've been working for years on trying, and I think we may be getting to a bipartisan consensus to get rural broadband done. So you're absolutely right. But in addition to that, you know, one of the things that we know the disparities in terms of the gaps in education that we see in disadvantaged communities in our city and across the state. And it's not just access to technology, but now you have the pandemic and this remote learning environment, which is only going to exacerbate the disparities that we know exist. Pittsburgh Public Schools had a very difficult time getting the technology into the hands of every single student that is necessary. I'm not sure that we're quite there yet. I think there's a plan to do it, but they can't do it on their own, and we need to have the state basically make again the types of investments that we expect that we used to. At one point, we spent the state contributed 50% of local school district budgets. Today, it's around 30%. So it's created problems for real property taxpayers and school districts in terms of finding the revenue, particularly in urban distressed areas that don't have the resources to basically close that gap and eliminate the disparities, so that we can give everybody a level playing field to move on with their lives and make a sustainable living for their families.
Thank you, Mr. Frankel. Mr. Walker.
Just real quick, I wanted to mention that Allegheny County was given enforcement rights for air quality and not the DEP in our county from the federal government to enforce the Clean Air Act. So the DEP doesn't really oversee air quality in Allegheny County because our county health department, which we're lucky to have, does that directly. To answer this question specifically, we need to not only address the short-term lack, but also the long-term lack. I was disappointed with the Pittsburgh Public Schools deployment of their online learning. They were missing, they had to delay the start of school by a week. People were having internet issues. They were having problems with getting computers out to families. And part of that problem is we need to have better internet infrastructure. It needs to be publicly funded and publicly managed. Right now, we're kind of reliant on this Verizon and Comcast, which are honestly delinquent in providing these like basic. We need this. This is another internet access is another human right in the United Nations. So we need municipal broadband. And really, what it reveals is that our deep disparities when it comes to poverty. Right, when people don't have internet, when people don't have computers, that reveals a poverty issue more so than anything else. So we need to confront those directly. We need to increase worker power by expanding unionization. And we also need to just make sure that people aren't getting crushed in our political system right now by corporations.
Thank you. Pennsylvania allows a tax credit known as the Educational Improvement Tax Credit Program to support charter, online, and private schools. In 2018, the state granted $124 million in educational tax credits, which instead of into those tax credits, instead of going into the general fund for public schools, roads, and other public goods and services in Pennsylvania. Do you support the Educational Improvement Tax Credit Program? And address, please, the issues related to the spending. Mr. Walker, the question to you first, please.
I am completely opposed to this tax credit. It sounds like something that corporate attorneys dreamed up and are like, man, we can make so much profit off of this legislation. I'm completely opposed to privatizing our schools, and this tax credit leads to doing that. It really just kind of moves, it's sort of like an indirect shifting of our resources from our public education infrastructure to a more privatized public education infrastructure that's kind of described as public because the funding is from our tax dollars. So I'm completely opposed to the EITC and also to school vouchers, and I think we need to crack down on enforcement of our privately run charter schools. We need to invest deeply in our public schools. This is the public schools for everybody. I went to public school my whole life, and we need to make sure that our public schools are up to snuff and that our society as a whole is being educated. So that's where we need to be investing. In general, I'm opposed to many tax credits. Tax credits are often written the way our government is done in Harrisburg. It's really clear with the amount of lobbyists that exist and the amount of campaign donations that go into elections. It's really clear that lobbyists try to carve out tax credits in our tax code to make profit for the corporations that they represent. So I'm generally opposed to tax credits unless it's something that we're really trying to push, like renewable energy.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Frankel.
Yes, this program was established probably a decade ago, and it was a modest program when it was first passed, and it was a compromise in order to basically avoid passing a voucher bill. I supported it initially. I have opposed every increase in that tax credit, which is now, as you noted, a more significant amount of money, and I believe it ought to be, those increases should have been directed back into public education. In general, tax credits are problematic and divert us from what we ought to be doing in terms of the public funding of resources around the state. But the initial deal was a compromise to avoid getting a voucher bill done that had broad-based support in the legislature. It was being pushed by Governor Ridge at the time as one of probably his top legislative priority. So we negotiated this compromise that was part of being able to avoid going deeper into a voucher program that to this day we've been able to stymie.
Thank you. Property taxes. In Pennsylvania, real estate taxes help fund public schools. Consequently, not all school districts are funded equally. In addition, Pennsylvania voters approved a constitutional amendment in 2017 that allows the legislature to pass a bill to effectively eliminate certain property taxes. Please explain what policies or legislation you would support or propose or oppose regarding any inequities in funding, as well as the elimination of the property tax. Mr. Frankel, question to you first, please.
Well, I don't support eliminating the property tax. I mean, that's been a canard that's been out there for many years. I mean, to a certain extent, it's provided a level of stable funding for our school districts. It's a challenge because it's not fairly applied because we don't reassess frequently enough. But it's a stable source of funding for our school districts. We need to take a look at other ways to find revenue for public education, and we provide relief for seniors and rent rebate and property tax rebates for people who are at the lower end of the economic scale. So we have some tools that have existed. We need to look at some others, but property taxes should be the only basis for funding public education. But they shouldn't be eliminated at the end of the day. My parents, who were retired years ago, should be paying property taxes as their parents did for their children, and as I do for future generations as well, even once we become retired individuals. So the property tax should remain in place, but we ought to find ways to find additional revenue on a fair taxing basis as well.
Thank you. Mr. Walker.
Yeah, I'm really concerned about that amendment. I voted no on the referendum when it came to my ballot. I think our situation, our state funding for education system is completely unfair. It impacts school districts that are in poor areas who can't afford, who have less property taxes to give to their school district disproportionately. In school districts that are in wealthy areas with high property taxes, their schools are just inherently better funded. So Pennsylvania has one of the lowest proportion of funding that comes from the states, and that's really sad because the state level government is the only way for us to kind of balance the inequities between different school districts. So what we need to do is, first of all, the property tax elimination is sort of like, it's just like one part. I'm not saying we should eliminate property taxes. I'm just saying like, it's a solution to a problem that doesn't consider the broader context of the problem, right? If we eliminate property taxes, we're suddenly left with zero funding, minimal funding for education. So we need to use the fair funding formula. Right now, it's only used for a small portion of state education funding, and that fair funding formula takes into account poverty levels, all sorts of disparities that exist between our districts, and it kind of accounts for that. So it better funds poorer areas, and it doesn't fund wealthier areas as much. Yeah, we need to expand that for all of our state education funding, and we need to make the pie bigger too, so Pittsburgh isn't negatively impacted.
Thank you. Speaking of education, student loan debt in the U.S. surpassed $1.6 trillion in 2019. What is your position on college debt forgiveness? What is your position on making college tuition free for all American students, or even Pennsylvania college students? Mr. Walker?
I'm supportive of it. I personally am crushed by student loan debt from my university education. And this is actually one of the main policies that are on my, that's on my piece of literature, is making colleges more affordable. I support free college tuition for our state schools. And I also support further investment in our state schools of higher education. So the legislation that I talk about on my piece of literature is, it basically makes it free if you make less than $100,000 to attend a state university. It reduces the cost of state-related universities like Pitt and Penn State and Temple. It also provides funding for students who want to go to community college, and it also provides funding for trade schools. So it's kind of a comprehensive piece of legislation, and that's one of the issues that I'm campaigning on, actually. So I'm fully supportive of that. I'm supportive of debt forgiveness. I don't have a specific plan for it right now, but I think it's much needed. The amount of student loan debt that our society has, people in my generation, myself have. For example, I'm not able to buy a car, I'm not able to buy a house, and that's because of the impact of student loan debt. And I know there's many, many people like me who face the same situation, and that just depresses our economy. So if we're able to forgive that, I think that we would see a large economic boost. We would improve quality of life for many in my generation and the following generations. And yeah, it would just be better overall.
Thank you. Frankel.
Student debt has become an overwhelming burden to many of our young people who can't afford to live away from home once they graduate from college, and we need to be able to address it. The resources that we currently have at the state level, whether it's FIA, the Pell Grants at the federal level, are inadequate and haven't kept up with the inflation of higher education. So I'm for forgiveness based on a means-tested basis. I mean, my children continue today to pay for their college educations and their student loans, and it's an enormous burden. Luckily, they are able to make those payments, but many individuals can't, and we ought to be in a position to make sure. And we're never going to address the broader economic disparities that we talked about earlier. In terms of our communities, or disadvantaged communities, and young people who don't have the resources to take on this debt unless we make college affordable. It's a major stepping stone. So loan forgiveness, depending on how it's structured and it needs to be means tested, makes an enormous amount of sense. And I think we ought to be able to do it. But again, it's about determining how we're going to find resources to expand the services that we have out in our community. You know, we're talking about needs for access to healthcare. We talk about needs for affordable housing. There's an extraordinary level of need out there to create the economic justice that we all want, but we got to find those resources.
Thank you. Would you support or oppose the Family Care Act, which is bipartisan legislation that calls for paid family and medical leave insurance for all employees in Pennsylvania through a statewide program? Why or why not? Mr. Frankel?
Yeah, I mean, look, this has been a core position of mine throughout my entire career. It's been something that's been important. I founded and I chaired the Women's Health Caucus that primarily was looking at preserving women's reproductive rights, but to take a look at the other issues that we need in our families, and particularly for women and single mothers in our community, is universal child care. So, and it's childcare and paid family leave. You can't get to a place of economic justice unless people are able to take off work for medical needs, for themselves, their families, their children, to take care of the needs of particularly of kids when you're a single parent. If we don't have paid family leave, it is a single really huge building block with respect to creating the economic justice that we need for all of our families in Pennsylvania.
Thank you. Mr. Walker?
I completely support the legislation, the Family Care Act. I also support universal child care, and I think medical leave, paid sick leave, I think it makes sense to people no matter what political party you're with. We do not want sick workers to be going to work and getting other people sick, getting people that their customers sick that they're dealing with. I just think that it can be really hard to discuss things that have bipartisan support because our political system is so polarized. Because of the kind of overwhelming nature of the two-party system, it's sort of become a zero-sum game. When there's only two parties, when one party is impacted, another party gains, and when another party is impacted, the first party gains. It makes it so that compromise is really hard to do because if you compromise with someone, then you're building their strength and hurting your own strength. But I think if we can kind of get out of this two-party mindset, red versus blue, we can start having conversations about with people in areas that are represented by Republicans, represented by Democrats. We can have discussions about whether they think that people who are sick should be forced to go to work. And I think that there are so many common sense solutions that our current polarization makes so difficult to discuss. And I'm excited to get outside of that polarization because I'm not part of one of the major two political parties. So yeah, this is a common sense solution, and this should be passed as soon as possible.
Thank you. The minimum wage in Pennsylvania is $7.25 per hour, as someone noted earlier. In Ohio, it's $8.70. In West Virginia, it's $8.75. Maryland is $11, and New York is $11.80 per hour, on its way to $15 per hour. What do you think of Pennsylvania's minimum wage, and do you have any goals to increase the rate? Mr. Walker, to you first, please.
Yeah, I think Pennsylvania's minimum wage is an absolute travesty. I know lots of people who make minimum wage, and it's there. You cannot have a family on it. You cannot. It makes it hard to buy a house. You're basically, if any sort of disaster happens, or even like a minor disaster, like if the car that you're paying loans on, like has a wheel come off, suddenly you have this huge bill that can kind of derail your entire life. So it definitely needs to be raised. We need to raise the tipped wage as well. It needs to be, I think it needs to be the same, the regular wage and the tipped wage. And I also think $15 is actually kind of disappointing. The Fight for 15 campaign started in 2012. It's 2020 now, about to become 2021. $15 is no longer good enough. We need to raise the minimum wage to $20 an hour or maybe more. But I think it's really hard because this is one of those issues that's become so polarized. It's become politicized. People kind of, the way people talk about it, it's sort of like they're just like spitting out Fox News talking points, rather than having a discussion about what they think people in their community, our collective Pennsylvania community, that people should be able to feed their families, take care of a family, raise a family, buy a house, afford to be able to have a car. We definitely need to raise the minimum wage. And I'm tired of seeing the obstruction in Harrisburg from Republicans on this, because it's become so polarized.
Thank you, Mr. Frankel.
Well, I talked about it's a no-brainer. The public supports it broadly across the state. I mean, poll after poll shows 70% of Pennsylvanians support increasing the minimum wage. I support the $15 minimum wage, and I support making tipped workers have equal standing with respect to the minimum wage. Its time has come. It's just mind-boggling to me that we've been unable to do this, particularly with the broad public support that we see across the state, across the country. This shouldn't be a polarizing issue. I agree. It has been a polarizing issue, and hopefully, as this election moves forward and the things that I'm seeing, I think we're going to have a change in Harrisburg that's going to give us the momentum that we're going to be able to make the minimum wage fair and life-sustaining for people and their families. And that's going to be something that I think is going to be a great success story as we move into the next session of the legislature. It's time. It's just an embarrassment on top of the fact that so many people are suffering today in our state. That $7.25 an hour is just beyond belief that we still have that here in Pennsylvania. So I'm optimistic that we're going to be able to address it moving forward.
Thank you. Along the same lines, Pennsylvania ranks 24th in the nation for gender pay disparity, where women earn 79 cents on the dollar as compared to men. Pennsylvania also has an executive order for state agencies that prohibits them from asking applicants or employees about their pay history, which is designed to get at the gender pay disparity. Would you support similar legislation for private businesses with the same prohibition? Mr. Frankel?
Yes, absolutely. Equal pay for equal work is a fundamental value, and pay information shouldn't be kept private. We ought to know, that what the disparities are within private companies as well. We know that it exists, and it should be transparent in order to be able to address it. This again is something that I think enjoys broad public support. But year after year, instead of actually getting a piece of legislation done that would address it, we've passed legislation to authorize a study of the pay disparities that exist. And it's not just women, it's also particularly African-American women are even worse off than white women in our state. The disparity is even much more significant. So it's a matter of fairness. It's a matter of something we've got to do. The whole issue, minimum wage, equal pay for equal work, access to healthcare, affordable housing. These are the fundamental tools that we need in order to create a more just and equal society where everybody has equal opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Frankel. Mr. Walker?
I absolutely support banning pay history for private employers. I also think that one thing that could make a big difference is supporting unionization in industries that are predominantly female, that are also extremely underpaid. I've read so many articles about the terrible working conditions of our caregivers across the state that are working in nursing homes and other similar facilities, and also in home caregivers. They're paid really low, they have minimal benefits, their job is rather dangerous actually. If we were able to unionize that industry, then they would be able to fight for better pay that would kind of help with the pay gap. But I mean, we need to be investing in the people who are taking care of the sick and elderly in our state. And I think when people think of the working class in Pennsylvania, you see this in national articles all the time. They think about the white working class that's working on pipelines. We need to be thinking about nurses and caregivers, because there are so many more people employed in those industries and they're actually building something like taking care of our community is something that adds to our values as society rather than building fracking infrastructure that not only causes local air pollution, water pollution, but also burdens our climate with greenhouse gas emissions that my generation and generations after me will be dealing with for years to come.
Thank you. A significant share of our current workforce in this legislative district is composed of healthcare workers, university staff, and technology workers. What is your position and why regarding the unionization of these and other workers? Mr. Walker?
Well, in my previous answer, I just gave a strong push for unionization in the healthcare worker sector. I'm completely supportive of it, not just of nurses, but also of basically anyone who works in a hospital. I think all workers should be unionized. I think unionization is an amazing way not only to build the power of people within the unions, but also to build the power of the broader working class. So many of our unions fight for things that affect all workers and not just the workers that are in their union. So I absolutely support university staff organizing. I support grad students organizing, and I support our technology workers, like those that work at Google or HCL, who recently unionized. And an article just came out about how Google is trying to export those jobs so that to kind of get around their unionization attempts. So yeah, I mean, I've shown up for events from the grad student organizing committee. I'm thoroughly supportive of them. And it's like, it's wild how much the University of Pittsburgh specifically has spent to hire attorneys. They spent millions of dollars to hire attorneys to defeat organizing efforts. When, you know, I mean, so much money needs to be spent on COVID, on education, and they're wasting this money to kind of defeat the right of workers to unionize. It's really disgusting. And it sucks to see that the same law firms being hired in all sorts of different industries. And just frankly, illegal practices that are being done.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Frankel?
Oh, I absolutely support the unionization of our healthcare workers, of faculty, particularly adjunct faculty, which are taken advantage of. I've marched with SEIU on this issue. I've taken a public position with respect to unionization. SEIU has endorsed me. That's the prime labor organizer, as well as the United Steelworkers in this sector that desperately needs to have the same protections that we've had for other sectors of our economy. These are like one of the remaining areas where unions have the opportunity really to improve the quality of life and the working conditions and the pay scales and the benefits for these workers who are our lifeblood in this community, are essential workers. They are where our economy has grown. I mean, we've had, UPMC is the largest employer in the state, and they have fought unionization tooth and nail. The University of Pittsburgh needs to do the same thing. Allegheny Health Network has allowed unionization to take place in many of their facilities, but still isn't universal. It still needs to become a part of the fabric of the way that they operate. Unions are critical to the quality of life for working people in this state and have always been, and I support these efforts.
Thank you. Labor issues segued nicely to social justice. Now will be our new topic. The City of Pittsburgh has a special election question on the ballot regarding the Independent Citizen Police Review Board. Specifically, the question is whether the Home Rule Charter should be amended and supplemented by expanding the powers of the Independent Citizen Police Review Board to allow the board to require police officers to participate in investigations, conducting performance audits of the police bureau, and preventing the removal of board members except for just cause and with city council approval. The question is, do you support or oppose the question, and why or why not? Mr. Frankel?
I support it. I already voted for it. This goes to the whole issue of policing reform that has become such an extraordinary issue that is polarizing our country right now, as we see the effects of these murders that have taken place in communities across the country, including the city of Pittsburgh with Antoine Rose. This is one step that further empowers the city of Pittsburgh to be able to address this issue, but we need to do our job at the state level. So I'm working along with the Pennsylvania Legislative Black Caucus with a whole portfolio of legislation, 2 bills of which we've done that go to the root of dealing with policing reform, dealing with the systemic racism that we see within our police departments in Pittsburgh, in other parts of the state, throughout this country. So we have a role. I support what's taking place locally, but we have a role at the state level that we need to be able to address this. So there's a package of bills that deal with chokeholds. That we passed a piece of legislation that requires a background check on police departments and a mental health check on police applicants as well. Those 2 bills were success stories that we got done on a bipartisan basis. There's much more work to be done. And I support, obviously, this referendum is a clear improvement, but not sufficient.
Thank you, Mr. Frankel. Mr. Walker.
I voted, I haven't voted yet. I'm going to vote yes on this referendum to expand the power of the Pittsburgh Civilian Police Review Board. The Green Party of Allegheny County democratically voted to endorse a yes vote. We've also democratically voted to endorse the demands of the Allegheny County Black Activists Organizer Collective, which includes a whole slew of policy demands. So those kind of fall into my platform with regards to criminal justice reform. So the number one thing, and this was pushed by the Black, Young, and Educated Civil Saturday protests, is to amend Section 508, the statutes that cover use of force. But there's a whole litany of things that we need to include to properly reform racial justice. So that includes banning cooperation between our local police departments and foreign militaries, through a deadly exchange with the Israeli military that kind of spread the use of that knee on neck technique. We need to get police out of schools statewide. We need to ban private police departments, for example, the ones that are at the University of Pittsburgh, on all of our university campuses, including our healthcare facility campuses. We also need to ban no-knock warrants statewide. We need to end partnerships with the state troopers and ICE. We need to end cash bail across the state. We need to increase funding for public defenders. We need to decriminalize sex work and decriminalize drugs while also legalizing recreational marijuana, including expanding records and reparations for those for Black communities which were disproportionately impacted.
Thank you. Regretfully, we are coming to the end of our time, so we'll have just a few more questions. Next question, though, is regarding gun violence. And we know that gun violence, including suicides, continues to be a problem in Pennsylvania. And this district experienced a great tragedy at the Tree of Life Synagogue just 2 years ago. What would you do to address gun issues, and where do you stand on policies such as increased background checks, banning high-capacity magazines, and other measures? Mr. Walker?
I definitely support all of those common sense gun reforms, increasing background checks, banning high-capacity weapons. So I support all of those. I think one of the responses to school shootings and the Tree of Life massacre are to kind of harden our schools and religious facilities. We're trying to have armed guards, we're trying to have metal detectors, we're trying to do bullet-resistant windows. And I think that kind of, I think that's a Band-Aid on the problems that we see when it comes to gun violence. We need to make sure that we're tackling the root cause. So it's mental health issues, it's isolation in our communities, it's radicalizing through the internet. Those are the things that we need to tackle. And then we also need to, I think we need to soften our institutions rather than harden them. So again, that means investing in counselors, investing in outreach specialists. And I think that would be much more effective in improving the violence that we see in our society.
Thank you. Mr. Frankel?
Thanks. I've been engaged in this issue from the day I walked into the legislature. I chaired the original Common Sense Gun Safety Caucus and reformulated that with Congresswoman Madeline Dean, who was a state rep at the time in the PA Safe Caucus. And we've been advocating for a portfolio of legislation that includes universal background checks, an ERPO law, the red flag bill that goes to what Mr. Walker was talking about, that would make it possible for people who recognize somebody going through a mental health crisis could have a weapon removed from their possession. Obviously magazine capacities, assault weapons bans, et cetera. These are all things that we ought to be able to do. I should point out, though, after 22 years of a lot of frustration, we had a glare of hope and a successful effort just 2 weeks before the two Retrieve Life shooting in October of 2018. We actually passed a piece of meaningful gun legislation that will remove weapons from the hands of people who are subject to protection from abuse order. This was opposed by the NRA and other so-called gun rights groups, and we were able to do it, and I was able to work with my Republican colleagues on a bipartisan basis with extraordinary work in the advocacy community to get this passed and signed into law. So again, it gives me some hope that we can find some ways to work on a bipartisan basis to address this scourge.
Thank you. And this will be our final question. Did you march in any of the protests that occurred in Pittsburgh since Memorial Day 2020? If so, which one and why? And if not, why not? Mr. Frankel?
Yes, I marched in the one that was in Squirrel Hill that started at the what we call the center of the universe at the corner of Forbes and Murray down into Oakland. And I've been to some others. I haven't marched, but I've been to some other rallies over a period of time. They've been extremely effective, I think, in being able to articulate this. And I've been proud that here in the city of Pittsburgh, by and large, they've been peaceful and well organized and articulate in terms of the way they've been able to shed light on this issue that is basically consuming the entire country finally. And I think they've done an extraordinary job in order to be able to highlight the problems of police violence and abuse, and the issue of valuing Black lives in a way that honors the democracy that we live in, and the issues of equality and equal justice and treatment. So this, along with other criminal justice issues that we need to be addressing at the state level, is something that I think is very important. This should be prioritized. This movement, these marches, these demonstrations have helped give voice to that, and I think have put an enormous amount of pressure on elected leaders to do something about it.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Walker?
Yeah, I've been at a lot of these marches. I've gone very consistently, unless there's it was tough towards the end of petitioning period where I couldn't make as many, but I've gone to many of them, and I disagree with Representative Frankel. I think definitely towards the end of these marches, there's been a lot of frustration on our inability to move any of our elected officials on these issues, especially our local ones. Another thing that I experienced that was the kind of response from the city and how they treated protesters in a variety of situations, with tear gas, rubber bullets, the blatant lies, lots of lies that were given in press releases and broadcasts by the media. And I know they were lies because I was at those marches. I saw what happened. So I think, yeah, it showed a lot of people that maybe some legislators, some elected officials that people thought were doing the right thing, how they kind of failed to rise up to the challenge. And I think a lot of people came out of those marches feeling disappointed and sort of pent up. And that's kind of motivated me to work even harder, because I think it's really easy to kind of speak to the issues without really changing any of the dynamics that led to the issue. And I think we need to have a deeper solution. Like, we're not going to be able to reform the institution of policing by just changing whether they can do chokeholds or not. And that's why I'm proud to say I haven't taken any money from police unions.
Thank you. And thank you, gentlemen. That concludes our question and answer period for this forum. And now we will have each candidate's closing 90-second statement. Since we started our forum with the question to Mr. Frankel, Mr. Walker will give the first closing statement. Go ahead, sir.
My name is Ting Walker, and I'm running for the Pennsylvania House, not because I want to, but because I need to. Our need to ban fracking and tackle climate change is extremely urgent. And we know absolutely that we aren't going to get this much needed change from our federal government, no matter who wins in November. To do this, we need to remove the corrupting influence of money in Harrisburg. Right now in Harrisburg, there's an oil and gas lobbyist for every single member of the legislature. We need to change the rules about campaign finance so that people can't just buy their way into the legislature. We also need to change the gift ban rules so that so that legislators are actually acting in the best interests of the people instead of the lobbyists that wine and dine them. So tonight, I've gotten an opportunity to present you with my vision for Pennsylvania. The vision was developed through years of struggle against multitudes of injustices to our society. We're facing an environmental crisis, a healthcare crisis, and a racial justice crisis, all during a global pandemic that's revealed the flaws of our social safety net. We need bold changes, and we need a transformation in our society so that we are never stuck in this situation ever again. If this vision is one that you want to see enacted, I need you to join my movement. I'm running against a 21-year incumbent who has raised literally millions of dollars over his countless terms from health insurance PACs, developers, law firms, and frackers. My campaign is entirely grassroots funded, and it needs you to join. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. And now, Mr. Frankel, your closing statement, please.
Thank you. First of all, I've never taken any money for any frackers. And I've been for finance reform forever, and we need to do it to remove a lot of the influence of money. But at the end of the day, my constituents are frustrated that we can't get effective reform done in Harrisburg. And what needs to be done is we need to elect Democrats across the state. I've spent my time this election cycle and the last election cycle trying to get like-minded progressive Democrats elected to the legislature. And that means finding the resources to do it. I'm optimistic that we're going to have change in Harrisburg. My community is engaged in races across the region to be able to make that transformation a reality. We need to be able to do this in order to secure access to healthcare, social justice for our communities of color, education funding, and to deal with a pandemic that has basically disrupted our lives in a way that we could never have imagined. So we need to protect the families that are suffering in this environment. We may make sure that they're going to have access to the cures and the vaccines that are available to get us out of this situation. We need to be focused on this pandemic, but the pandemic itself has revealed so many other issues that we're focused on as Democrats to get this done. And the Democrats, being in the majority in Harrisburg, will have the opportunity to do that, and you can hold us accountable to that.
Thank you, gentlemen. On behalf of the League of Women Voters of Greater Pittsburgh, I would like to thank both of our candidates for participating in this forum. It is one of the most important ways that voters in your district, the 23rd Legislative District of Pennsylvania, can learn about your positions on the issues important to them. Voters who are watching, please remember that you can obtain information about all the races on your ballot in your area by going to vote411.org. Enter your street address, and then the ballot for your specific residence will pop up. Please remember, Election Day is November 3rd, a Tuesday. In Pennsylvania, the deadline for voter registration is October 19th, and the deadline for an application for mail-in or absentee ballot is October 27th. If returning a ballot by mail, mail-in and absentee ballots must be postmarked no later than 8 p.m. on Tuesday, November 3rd, and received by Friday, November 6th by the Allegheny County Election Division. If returning a ballot in person, it must be received by 8 p.m. on November 3rd at the County Election Office in downtown Pittsburgh. If voting in person, the polls are open 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. on Tuesday, November 3rd. Information on more election specifics can be found on votespa.com. And overall, this forum is the property of the League of Women Voters of Greater Pittsburgh and can be found in its entirety on the League's Facebook page. Again, thank you for joining us. Thank you for participating. And remember, please vote.